This is Lead Balloon, and I'm Dusty Weiss. It was 1993, and in the power vacuum left by the fall of the Soviet Union, it was once again a dangerous time to be a Jewish person living in Eastern Europe. The United Jewish Appeal had a bold plan to help 1 million Jews emigrate from the post-Soviet states to the nation of Israel, but the world's attention was focused elsewhere, and fundraising needed a massive boost. So the UJA hired public relations agency founder Dick Grove and his team to travel to the other side of the world and document the dire need for help, starting in the belly of the beast itself, Moscow.
I flew over by myself. The rest of the crew, and there was probably maybe 4 or 5 of us, we had one videographer with us who actually worked at one point in time for NFL Films. I thought that was interesting because he wore a jacket that said NFL Films on the back. He was one of the videographers we had with us, but mainly it was just 4 or 5 of us, and then we picked up freelancers along the way. We actually found a really good guy while we were in Moscow. There was nobody, obviously in Uzbekistan, so that's where we brought our own people. But the way it worked was we met up in Moscow. We spent about 3 or 4 days in Moscow. And at that time, we also interviewed Saransky, who was one of the lead dissidents from Russia. And we met with him and talked to him about the problem. And he gave us some tips on the stories and so forth. He was a huge proponent, obviously. So from there, we headed down to Uzbekistan. And oh my God, the trip to Uzbekistan was truly adventuresome because we were on a Aeroflot jet, which I wouldn't consider flyworthy in the States at all. I still remember that. Some of the seats were broken. Some didn't have seat belts. And Ray and I, who was, like I said, the guy that came with me and the lead guy and my partner, so to speak, that was the videographer on it. But we both laughed nervously, let's put it that way. So if there was ever any sense of danger, it wasn't being on the ground, it was in that plane. And Uzbekistan was truly a fascinating place because very poor. Just the people were wonderful. The people we met in what was, I guess you'd call the restaurants, there were certainly, I've got photographs I found that of going into a couple of what would be called grocery stores, if you want to call it that, were practically bare shelves with a few things on it. It was a dramatic awakening for somebody coming from abundance to seeing how people were living. And they were wonderful people. I'm serious. They were just definitely wonderful people. I had been to Vietnam a few years before that in the late 80s, 88 and 89 on trips. And it reminded me of the same thing, that the people have nothing to do with the government. It's the government that are full of crap, if you pardon my French. But the people were wonderful. And the more we got to know them, the more we really appreciated what they were going through.
From Tashkent, the capital city of Uzbekistan, Dick's team took a van out into the countryside and embedded with some townspeople who were fleeing the country. The idea being that they would actually take the flight with them from Uzbekistan to Tel Aviv in Israel and learn their stories along the way.
It was a Chinese 747 that had been chartered, and it was to leave at midnight for Tel Aviv. And that scene will be embedded in my head forever, probably. The long lines of the diaspora, of the Jewish people lined up, and they were only allowed to take 1 or 2 duffel bags per family. And in many cases, families were split up because some people wanted to go, some people didn't. There was a limited amount of people that could go. And that scene was truly emotional. You can imagine at midnight as they're loading gear and getting onto that. And most of them, of course, have never flown on a plane, ever. And getting in and loading into that big plane. And then the flight, we didn't sleep at all, obviously. The ones that were awake, we went up and down the aisles, interviewing, photographing, getting their stories. And I mentioned previously, there was one old soldier that I particularly enjoyed because he still had some medals. He was wearing his medals, but inside of his forearm was a tattoo. So he had obviously been in a concentration camp, and he didn't speak any English whatsoever, but it was just so moving to see that guy with those medals, that tattoo, and realizing, my God, what this guy has gone through in his life. We arrived at, I don't know what it was, 6 or 7 in the morning, I'm not sure, dawn, and unloaded the plane with the people. And from there, we got a little sleep. But then we spent another week traveling around Israel, finding people that had already come and what they were doing now, and interviewed them and what their lives were like and adjusting to living in Israel. And in that case, it was fascinating because some of those people we interviewed were quite well educated. But at that time, there were too many. They were coming in too fast. There was something like 200,000 of them brought in within a year. And there just weren't jobs. There weren't positions or anything. So many of them, you could find a doctor or a lawyer who was a street sweeper. That's all they could get. Many musicians, which we thought was fascinating. And in one town up in Haifa, they had organized an orchestra of Soviet diaspora that had come and were now playing in an orchestra. And we photographed that, and we did a piece on NBC on that performance. It was very moving.
Ron Friedman, who was the director of Operation Exodus, calls the video footage that Dick Grove and Ray Fox sent back tremendous, and says that there are still moments that stick out in his memory even today.
And that video showed, for example, a prominent opera singer in the former Soviet Union who initially, when he came to Israel, because he had to learn about society, had to work as a street cleaner. And then we followed him, and it turned out, he then went on to greater things in Israel. Nothing wrong with being a street cleaner, but he needed to do something while he was able to move forward. And that happened with engineers and scientists, and they actually changed, given their education and their professional skills, the face, if you will, of Israeli society. And they doubled, actually, the GDP, the gross domestic product of Israel, and they are now integrated into Israeli society.
But even with hours of compelling footage and moving stories, Dick Grove knew that the job was only half done. Because having a worthy cause, that's a nonprofit's role. Making people care about that worthy cause, that is the role of the public relations maven. So they stowed their gear and flew back to the States, where the next phase in Operation Exodus's PR campaign could begin.